Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Lonnie, and in this video, I will be painting this New England house in watercolor. Mixing the first wash. First wash is the undertone of the painting. And what I do, or what I'm starting to do here with the sky, is a mixture of a couple of blues, cerulean blue, French ultramarine with a little bit of alizarin crimson to dull it down a little bit. I don't like to have super saturated skies, so I do dull it down with a red, in this case alizarin crimson. And as I'm moving down towards the house, I leave a little bit of the very top of the house. I'll leave a white highlight there, but I am painting over the house in the middle and painting down around the second story windows, because in that area I do plan on bringing in a yellow, and this is just water that I'm bringing down. The blue, just so once I do mix in the yellow, it'll be a soft edge versus leaving a hard edge with the blue. You can see at the bottom of the blue it is pulling up there. That's key to keep the soft edges, is to keep the paper and the paint wet. And I do bring in the yellow here, which is a mixture of a yellow ochre and a Hansa yellow medium. And with the spray bottle, just to make sure that the blue sky above stays wet while I'm still working into it. And as I reach the bottom, I do mix a little bit of burnt sienna just to darken it a little, but this will all dry pretty light. And this lighter layer, this first layer, will show through if I leave it. It'll be the highlights as I add shadows on. The highlights won't be perfectly white, or they won't be an exact white. It'll be this first underpaint, or this first tone that I'm laying down. You can see how wet the paper is by the bead of water at the bottom here. And while the paper is wet, or while the paint is wet, you can pretty much mix in any color you like, and it will stay, all the edges will stay soft because the paint will bleed into the adjacent layers and won't leave a hard edge. But you can see at the top of the paper as it's drying, that yellow in the house. I'll come back later to soften those edges, but it is getting a little bit dry as I'm working here on the left hand side of the paper, adding some reds to what will be in the background, a fence and some trees. And I decided that the sky wasn't dark enough, so I did come back. The paper was drying, but it was still wet enough to where I felt okay coming back with a darker sky, or darker wash at the very top of the sky. And I'm just cleaning up the edges with a little bit of water so it blends in with the first layer, which is almost dry. So I do add a little bit of water and just blend down. Those are those little strokes that I'm just blending that into the first wash. You do have to be careful. If that first wash was completely dry, it would be hard to get rid of that hard edge of the second wash that I laid on top of it. Speeding the video up now. I've already started laying in some of the shadows in the foreground. These aren't the final shadows, but they are giving me a sense of where there is going to be shadow versus where there is going to be light, especially in the street and the sidewalk here. You can already see with this first layer of dark color that the yellow that I laid in with the initial wash is showing through that shadow and is giving it a little bit of a glow. And I will try to preserve that by allowing this layer to dry before I lay on another layer of darks. Moving into the background, I'm working on the fence and trees in this just to the left of the house. And what I really wanted to go for in this area was a consistent value and consistent color. Well, maybe not consistent color, but a consistent value. You can see I'm switching to green as I get up into the trees, but for the fence I did start with an orange purplish color. And for the mass of trees, it's a purple or a green color. And as I'm working on the sidewalk or the driveway that goes to the back of the house, you'll see I'll lay in another color of blue. In the foreground, I started working on the shadows for the bushes that are just to the left of the house. And what I'm trying to do here is mix or have those bushes kind of meld into this fence area that I put in the background. And I do that by painting it all while it's all still wet. So the wet layers of paint that I laid in for the fence will merge and kind of drip into the shadows for the bushes that I just placed. Mainly because I didn't want a hard edge there. This is not the focal point of the image, but I did want something interesting. So I am switching the colors around between greens and blues, purples for the fence, orange for the fence. The shadows around the base layer of the bush you see I leave as a cooler purple color. Even though it's not quite as cool as the blue that I initially laid in for the sky, it is cooler than the adjacent colors. And while it's still wet in the background, I decided that the trees weren't quite dark enough, so I did begin laying in a darker wash on top of the green that was there. And you can see, especially at the top of the page, that green is dried much lighter than when I initially laid it in. Something you have to keep in mind with watercolor: as it dries, in most cases it'll dry a lot lighter than when it's wet. You can see, especially in the house, the yellow and the blue wash. You can barely see the blue in this video, but it did dry much lighter than I initially laid it in. Working back with the shadows and the bushes to the right of the house. In this case, I didn't start with the dark shadow areas, but I did start with the mid-tone green, thinking about where I want highlights to remain for the bushes and flowers in this area, painting around those highlights with the mid-tone green, working that same mid-tone green into the background. In the background, this will likely stay that green versus the foreground where I will add subsequent layers which will be darker. Forgot to record the cherry blossom. Those kind of just popped up into the video here, but I just used a wash of alizarin crimson with a little bit of titanium white, pretty transparent, but I did lay that in kind of off camera, you could say. And around that I'm painting in the roof. And it's a little bit wet, but I really wanted a soft edge of the pink trees in the foreground versus the roof. I didn't want that to be a hard edge in between the two. So even though I'm carefully painting in the roof, I am going back with a little bit of water to blend the edges between the pink and the blue of the window and the grayish color or the grayish tone of the roof. Adding a little shadow at the dormers, painting in the blue of the windows, blue reflecting the sky. And just to make it a little bit more interesting, it is a bit of a gradient for the windows, but I don't want it to be too detailed or too developed. It is again, it's not the focal point of the image, which in this case will be the red door, which you'll see I'll begin painting in as I work down the house. Painting a shadow, one of the main shadows in the house. It's tricky getting the color right, and I'll put the image of the reference material, but that green was a tricky color to get right. But I started with the shadow and then I backed that off a little bit to get the right green that I was looking for the house. I think it worked out pretty well here. Not too concerned with matching it exactly, but just making sure in relation to the other colors that it did remain close enough to the original or to the correct color of the actual house. I really concentrated on getting the values correct. You see here I actually redid the shadow. I just added a little bit of water to lift the paint off, and I'm going over this shadow with the a little bit lighter color, and also I wanted to change the color of the blue of the shadow. And using that same shadow color, I work my way down the left hand side of this bay window with that shadow color. You can see once the shadow goes in that part of the house really pops. Adding in the base layer for the house color in and around the tree, trying to fill in the gaps where I left open in this tree. I don't know if it's a cherry blossom or not. Feel free to add in the comments if you know what type of tree that is. But adding in color for the house just that will poke through. And then you see the yellow color that I'm adding. It's a Hansa yellow medium with a little bit of burnt sienna, and also the alizarin crimson in these shadow areas. And I'm doing that because I noticed that the initial wash, especially in the shadows, isn't coming through as much as I thought it would. So I'm adding this additional layer of bright color that I will come back later and lay over the dark shadow, but hoping that that will give it a little bit of, give the shadows a little bit of a glow in those areas. And the focal point of the image, finally getting to here where I'm laying in just a base color for the door area, the main door. It's a red door, and that same red shows up around each of the windows, so I am showing that, or I am drawing that in, and I'll work around each window here, keeping it a mid-tone, knowing that in some areas I'll darken the red. And here around the door, you can see that it's, especially the door area, it is pretty flat, and as I'm adding the red around the windows, it's pretty flat. This base color will dry as the mid-tone. Around the door, it's going to be the highlight color, and you'll see once I add in the shadow, a little bit of detail, that flatness will go away. But adding in this mid-tone or this mid-color just helps get all the shapes where I want them so I can see them before I add in detail. And for the porch area and stairs, those are all red, so adding in the same mid-tone red for all of those. Leaving the white for the white painted stair risers, and you'll see as I start the railing here in a little bit, trying to leave the white railing while painting the red around it. The red I'm using is Pyrrole Red from Daniel Smith. Really bright red. I actually really like using that red. Same thing for this window, a little bit of a gradient, but it's not the focal point, so don't spend too much time on the window. And with these windows, laying in a grayish blue color, just to have a little bit of a gradient. I'll paint the shadow on the edge of the window just so it looks a little bit realistic, but not leaving too much or not adding too much detail to these windows, just to make it look a little bit, add a little bit of depth to it. And you can see here's the main red, almost pure Pyrrole Red from the tube. And across the light areas, a little bit watered down red. You can see once those two layers were added, the door, it looks like a shadow on the door, and that light part looks like sun is shining on the door. Just by adding in the saturated dark and the saturated red for the light part of the door. From there, I'll move around this entry area, and each one of the areas doing the same thing, where I'm adding a dark color for the dark areas in shadow, and I'll add a little bit more saturated red for the areas that are in light, to give it the depth and contrast, since this is going to be the main or the focal point of the image. So I will use my darkest or most saturated colors here. Adding in a little bit of shadow up at the eave. And then working over some of the edges between the house and the trees in the background. Some of those edges I don't want to be too sharp, so I do blend them in or paint a similar tone on the house that I did paint in the background. Mainly to keep the focus on the door, where that focal point, or having the most contrast at the focal point of the image. So in some areas as I'm bouncing around, I'm reducing contrast by painting a little bit more mid-tone, or I'm softening edges by mixing in water or scrubbing in peak parts of the house with the background to have them blend in a little bit more, so they're not standing out too much. And as I did on the door, I'm doing here to the accents around the door, I'm adding in more saturated red. For the detail around the door. And I'll darken where there is shadow just so it makes sense and makes that this is under a covered porch area. But adding in the more saturated red gives it a little bit of a glow, so it feels like sun is shining on it. Versus trying to leave, for example, the white of the paper as a highlight. In this case, I'm using just a saturated color. I'm surrounded by shadow, or surrounded by, this case, the really light blue forming kind of the columns of this porch area. And the stone step at the base of the stairs, adding in shadow for that. Using a flat synthetic brush, which is really nice for those sharp edges. A synthetic brush really holds its edge, makes it easy for especially architectural drawings where that straight edge is important. Darkening some of the areas around the porch to add a little bit more contrast. Softening one of the edges up at the roof. This goes back to the point that I was making about contrast. I felt the roof was a little bit too bright and a little bit too contrasty, so I did darken it a little bit to make it a little bit closer to the tone of the background trees. As you can see, I'm lifting paint in specific areas. I wet the paper to try to soften the edges between the roof and the trees in the foreground and the trees in the background. You see I'm redoing that edge to bring those two, the roof and the background, a little bit closer to each other, and then blending the edge so it almost melts into each other. And then just a hint of a tree trunk with some limbs, add a little bit more depth, and then I jump back to the foreground to darken around the plants and add in some of the darker shadows. Adding in a little bit of Hansa yellow to the bushes, just to add a little bit more life to those. And I'll work over on the right for the mid-tone of the trees. Actually, I will begin to add the tree trunk for this tree at the front, which I have no idea what kind of tree it is, but I've been calling it a cherry blossom because that's what it reminds me of. Like I said, add in the comments if you have any idea what kind of tree that is. That'll be our mystery of the day. But you can see the trunk that I add here is much darker than the background tree to the left of the house, because as I come forward, the darkest colors will be here in the foreground. And I mix these darks from a mixture of transparent brown oxide and French ultramarine. Jumping back to the house in the front yard. I'm not even going to guess what type of flowers these are, but I'm adding in some base colors for blue and purple flowers, and there are also some yellow and red flowers in the front yard. A little bit of shadow to the steps. You can see my painting method is to kind of just jump around and paint everything at once. A little bit of red for the front porch, a little bit of shadow for the window red. Shadow up top around the windows, and then a little bit of shadow for the steps again and the railings. And then really adding in darkness to this shadow on the sidewalk. This lower area of the image will help frame the painting as a whole and will help push the viewer's eye to the door, which is the focal point. And I blend that shadow into the background, really trying to connect this one dark shape in the foreground to a lot of things in the background and the foreground. Hinting at the fact that this shadow may be created by a tree off page or off camera here. So a little bit of dabs for leaves, shadow leaves. And then hinting at the sidewalk with a few strokes. Shrinking the light value here in the sidewalk. Kind of compressing your viewport. Moving back to the front yard, since I already had a little bit of dark paint on my brush, I move into the shadows of the plants and the flowers. Front yard on the left, front yard on the right. This dark isn't the same blue though. I did mix yellow in to make a really dark green. Maybe hard to tell on camera. Maybe looks a little bit black, but it is pretty dark green. Even around the flowers, I use this dark green as a kind of a common shadow color. Keeping in mind where I want the shadows for, or highlights for the flowers, and with this tinier brush I am adding in kind of blue shadow color around, I think these are hydrangeas. Add in the comments how you pronounce that. And then purple shadow for the flowers here, leaving the initial wash visible as a highlight color. and then mixing between or bouncing between shadows, midtones to form this front yard area. Adding in a really dark shadow under the bay window where the house meets the foundation wall behind the flowers to make the contrast between the flowers in the foreground and that dark shadow a little bit greater. Even though it's not the focal point of the image, it is in the foreground, so I do have a pretty good range of dark to really darks to really bright highlight areas. Which is okay in this case because the door is such a bright saturated red. It will still remain the focal point of the image, even though I am adding in some pretty darks to areas outside of the door area, and there is some pretty high contrast outside of that area. The saturated red is really owning the focal point of the image. And on the door I am adding a little bit of detail, hinting at some windows, hinting at some paneling in the door. You do have to be careful when you add that kind of detail. Sometimes if you add in too dark or too light, it takes away from the illusion you see there. I use my finger to wipe away because it was a little bit too dark on the panels. But you do want to make sure that the details you add are within the same tonal ranges of the initial shadow and highlight, which really added to the depth of the door. Working on the, what I'm going to call a cherry blossom tree here. Adding in a mid-tone pink color to draw it forward a little bit. And I do say a little bit a lot. If you're counting, feel free to drop in the comments how many times I've said a little bit. And that's just water that I'm adding on top of the tree to soften some of the edges. And not sure what I thought was a good idea here, but that definitely hurts the finger. There you can see I switched to the brush just to splatter this pretty saturated red, pinkish color to represent the flowers. Learned my lesson, so I'm using the tip of a brush instead of my finger, which I started to do. That was a mistake. Coming back where the flowers, I added a yellow color, kind of a yellow haze glaze in the flower area, and now I'm using the shadow to add a little bit of contrast to make those yellow areas stand out a little bit. And then shadow for the dormer. You can see once that shadow goes in, the dormers really do pop out of the roof there. But I try to make sure that I don't add too much detail. Adding in final details, I'm using paint straight from the tube, in this case the Hansa Yellow Medium, primarily going over with a dry brush over areas of the bushes to add a little bit of sense of sunlight hitting them. And you'll see I'll also use blobs of paint to suggest flowers. You can see the yellow flowers on the right hand side of the front yard versus on the left hand side of the yard where I've just brushed over entire areas of the bush with this yellow that still shows some of the mid-tone greens in the background and gives a little bit more life to the painting. So that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you like this video, feel free to hit the like button or subscribe to my channel. Until next time, thanks.